Hi, I'm Marc Goddard and welcome to Mixed Martial Arts Officials Training Online. So let's look at what this online content and course is designed to achieve. Mixed martial arts today, from an official's standpoint, in many areas can be vastly misconceived, misinterpreted and miscommunicated. What I would like to do is offer you a full and detailed explanation on the unified rules of mixed martial arts that govern our sport. So what I would like to be able to do is offer some uniformity, education, the ridding of misconceptions and the righting of some wrongs that surround our sport. Obviously, bringing the content online it presents its own uniqueness. The world is a big place, and obviously the current situation that we found ourselves in with the pandemic means that travel and face-to-face time is not always easy to achieve. So bringing this content online removes those barriers. Something else I would like to point out is the importance of the training and ultimately what it's leading to. If we split officials training into two definite parts, the first would be the theoretical side and the second would be the practical side. What this course is not designed to do is to give the viewer and the watcher, you, at the end of the content and the online course, to stand up and say, I am now a fully qualified mixed martial arts referee and/or judge. That would be irresponsible. What we can absolutely do is deliver and explain the theoretical knowledge that you need as an official. First and foremost, that is a fundamental, important part of your arsenal and education as an MMA official. You have to understand the written word. You have to be able to explain the rule book. You have to explain the judging criteria. But what we can't do, and what this online course won't do, is give you the practical experience and the practical knowledge, a very, very fundamental and important part of being an official. The main purpose of this online content, to repeat, is to give and deliver the theoretical knowledge that we absolutely can do online. We all start from somewhere. And if today is the first point of starting for you, I'm excited, I'm pleased, and I'm honored that we can begin this journey together. My promise to you is at the end of this content, you will unequivocally have a far greater and deeper understanding of the unified rules of mixed martial arts than when you began. Judging in MMA, a much contested and very much misunderstood part of our sport. This will give me and you the opportunity to understand exactly what it is judges should be considering, what they do and how they do it. It is perhaps the most misconstrued and misunderstood part of our sport, and that is what actually constitutes a judge's reasoning, what actually constitutes a judge's assessment, and just how exactly and what and why judges are looking for in judging a mixed martial arts contest. There are two distinct blocks that I would like to split this into, and the first is looking at the scoring system that mixed martial arts currently employs, and the second, a much more detailed and in-depth part, is the criteria in which a judge uses to render their assessment for a round or fight taking place. First part we're going to look at is the scoring system that is used in MMA, and that is the 10-point must system. Something I would like to stress upon everybody who is listening, and this is quite possibly one of the most misunderstood parts of our game and of our sport. When people talk about the 10-point must system as an add-on or a drag-in from boxing, yes, the scoring system, i.e. the points in which we attribute to the winner of a round, is the same. It's the same that's used in boxing. But something that is not understood and something that hasn't been very well explained is the use of the 10-point must system as a scoring system, as a secondary action. That is where the similarities will finish. The criteria, the emphasis, the education, and how a judge will actually determine the winner of that round and how many points to attribute to a fighter, that is all contained within the criteria itself. We can take that part to the side. Something that I cannot overemphasize enough. We can leave the scoring system to the side for the moment, whether it's 10 points, 50 points, 100 points. The points in which you will attribute to a fighter as a judge who you see winning that round, we can park it as irrelevant right now. It's the criteria, the understanding, the application, and the use of said criteria in the correct way, in the order in which it's written out for judges to use. That is where all that emphasis in detail must be. It's your understanding of that criteria, your application of that criteria. That is fundamentally where we must concentrate on. The fact that we then use that criteria to ascertain the winner of a round, the points in which we give it, that's the secondary action. You know, that 10-point must system that is sat there waiting to be told what to do at the end of any given round by you, the judge. It's not the 10-point must system's fault. We can forget all the comparisons to boxing. This is not boxing. Mixed martial arts has its own criteria, a clearly defined and set list of criteria that we're going to look at in great detail. The misconception that I want to get over here is the fact that the use of the 10-point must system for mixed martial arts is wrong. It isn't wrong. We are not saying that it's the finished article. We are not saying that we may look at evolution and perhaps another scoring system that will come into play. But the point that I must impress here, and the point that I have to get across, is the attribution and the giving of points to a fighter at the end of a round is a secondary action. All that importance, all that education, and all that understanding for that the judge employs in order to give and pick the correct winner of a round, that all falls within the criteria used and the understanding of said criteria. So just to reiterate the importance, the fact that I cannot overstate enough when it comes to mixed martial arts and the use of the 10-point must system as a scoring system, just to remind, just to re-emphasize and underline the fact that the scoring system is the secondary action. All that information and emphasis is placed upon what actually happens during a round of fighting, i.e. the correct interpretation and application of the criteria, something that we'll go into look at great detail. Some fairly common misconceptions to be able to put right when it comes to the 10-point must system and the scoring attributed and given to a fighter at the end of any given round. The winner of a round will get 10 points and the loser 9 or less. In unified mixed martial arts, generally without point deductions, the lowest score that a judge will give is 10-7. we will look in great detail the differences between 10, 10, 9, 8 and 7, the definition and application thereof. Another misconception is you can have a 10-10 even round. We will look into great detail a little bit further on into what actually constitutes and the factors and scenarios that may lead to a 10-10 round. But if anybody ever tells you that a 10-10 round you cannot give, that is simply not true. We will look in great detail, as I say, and breaking that down and showing the scenarios and very, very rare occurrences in which that possibly could present itself. Rounds shall always be scored as a whole, and it's not what happened in the first 30 seconds or the last 30 seconds. A professional mixed martial arts contest is a 5-minute long round. A good, considered and competent judge is taking into consideration exactly what happened for the whole duration of that 5 or 3 minute window in amateurs. The whole story of the round is the picture in which the judge will understand what happened and attribute the score accordingly. A knockdown in mixed martial arts does not automatically qualify or signify a 10-8 round for scoring. This is not boxing, this is mixed martial arts. Mixed martial arts has its own defined set of criteria that we are going to go into very fine detail to dissect, look at and understand. And again, it's primarily about the misconception busting and getting the correct information out there, firstly to the people who are going to be in charge of sitting down and scoring the contest, but bringing that to a widest possible audience too. Point deductions. If a referee deducts a point from a fighter, you as the judge will signify and notify that on your scorecard accordingly. Deducted points by the referee, and only the referee is the person authorised to deduct the points, should be attributed, marked and scored correctly on the round and scorecard in which that foul and instance occurred. So in summary, when it comes to the 10-point must system and the fact that that is the scoring system in which we currently use in mixed martial arts, for me it's about ridding the misinformation and dodging and eradicating the misconceptions out there, of which there are many. But at the moment, the scoring system that we use, it's a nice, concise, even whole number, the 10-point must system. That is not the problem when it comes to mixed martial arts judging. The problem when it comes to mixed martial arts judging is the misconception that that's a complete bring-in and an add-over from boxing. It's not. The fact that we use it as the secondary action in the point attribution and giving of points to fighters winning rounds, that's the commonality. But the way in which we arrive to that destination, how we ascertain, assess and give the points, to repeat, everything falls within the understanding and the correct use and implementation of the criteria. That is where we're going to dive in to great depth and understand and dissect next. One of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to understanding what actually the criteria for mixed martial arts judging is a lot of people within the sport, even people who have been in the sport at the highest possible level and been in the sport for the longest number of years, they either have the criteria mixed up, they're not exactly sure on how it's defined, and they're not sure on the priority and the order in which it's placed. I have lost count, I've simply lost count on the amount of times I've had one-to-one conversations with prominent people, fighters, even at the highest possible level within this sport. And again, I can bring that back to something we touched upon when we were talking about referees and the rules, is the fact that we are a young sport, and with that comes many problems. And one of those problems in this instance, when we're talking about judging, is the misconceptions and misinformation. If we look at the broadcast, for instance, for the UFC, they bring a lot of information to a lot of people, and you will see quite clearly defined when they're going through the start of a broadcast or a pay-per-view. They will flash up a couple of bullet points, and they will talk about how unified mixed martial arts is judged and what the judges are actually looking for. If I go back and look at that and talk to some people about that, they will actually have it the wrong way around. What they think is the most common thing, or the number one thing that a judge is actually looking to score in a fight, is actually the last thing. And in many instances, when using the criteria correctly for how it was designed and derived and applied, it may not even get to that. So when a judge sits down to score a round of fighting, and that's something that we have to get across here, something that a lot of people don't actually understand. In a 3-round or a 5-round fight, judges are evaluating single rounds at a time. We are not rendering the decision based on the fight as a whole. At the end of any given round, a judge will attribute and write his score accordingly, and that is then moved on. It's not a case of looking at the picture or how a particular fight will end at the end of a 5th round or the end of a 3-round contest. Fights and judges will sit there and they will look at a round of scoring in singular fashion. They will attribute their score based upon the story and the picture that they saw in that round, and that round alone. So the most important point before any fight would begin is that the person, in this instance a judge, sitting down to be able to render their score, it's about giving that fighter the best possible chance. That means that a trained, competent and understood judge is sitting in that chair. One of 3 people sat in that chair. They need to understand the criteria from back to front, inside and out. They need to understand the use of the criteria, back to front and inside and out. And it's about simplifying the role for the judge, simplifying that they understand exactly what they should be looking for and exactly what they should be evaluating when it comes to scoring a round of fighting. So, in keeping with the essence of simplifying, explaining and understanding the current criteria that a judge will use in order to understand and score a mixed martial arts contest, it is as follows. Number 1, the first port of call, the first thing that a judge should be considering in any round of fighting, in any fight, anywhere on the planet, this will never change. It is effective striking and or grappling. That has always been the same. That shall remain the same, and that shan't change. The reason that it says and or grappling is, of course, because I need to understand the difference of where the significance of either of those things had actually taken place. There are many times when a mixed martial arts contest will play out like a boxing match or a kickboxing match. So there is no grappling to even consider when it comes to giving a score in that round. Conversely, there can be rounds that are quite wrestling or jiu-jitsu orientated, and there could be very little striking, or it could be interspersed with striking. But the first thing a judge needs to understand is that striking and grappling are both equally considered and given equal weight. It is where the significance of either of those 2 things that took place is where the weight will be attributed accordingly. So effective striking, we hear it, but what does it mean? Effective striking is considering and judging the legal number of strikes landed to my opponent. Punches, kicks, knees, elbows are all strikes. Target areas are the head, the arms, the body and the legs. All legal target areas, all effective strikes. What do we mean by effective? What we are looking for what we are giving significance to and weight to is the heavier, more impactful and or damaging strikes as opposed to the number of strikes. Factors that a judge may consider is the appearance of a fighter causing him to stagger, causing him to show discomfort, causing him to show pain from a legal strike landed. If two fighters are simply moving freely and they're exchanging 1-2s or jabs and low kicks, they may be scoring in terms of the number of strikes landed. That could be very equal or close. But if a heavier, more impactful and more cumulative strike got through and hurt my opponent, and that is my assertion and decision as a judge that that's what I saw happen, then that is where I will give the weight and credence to. In essence, it is always a quality over a quantity approach. And in a round of fighting, that can be so finite and it can be so fine. It could be a one punch difference or a one kick difference, a liver kick, a body kick, a low kick, a head kick, one punch, a hook, a straight shot, a body shot. It could be that close. Sometimes, and actually in quite a lot of instances, the fighter who is edged ahead in both number and quality of shots is clearly going to win the round. But that is not always the case. A fighter could outland a fighter in terms of number of strikes landed, but may not necessarily win that round. What the judge is always looking for is the effectiveness, the damage and the impact of strikes that are landed. That is always the preference over the quantity. And like I said, sometimes at the end of a round, we could have a very similar output, a real close output in terms of the number of strikes landed, but it could be that 1 or 2 strike difference that the judge's assertion and decision-making process is given that preference to. It is the immediate cumulative damage and impact measured that is always given the higher preference over the total number of strikes landed. Factors that we could consider as a judge when we're looking at effective striking is the appearance of discomfort or pain that a fighter may show. If I get landed with a significant concussive headshot, knee, punch or a kick, and I stagger or I get pushed back or I show discomfort and pain, it could happen from a body shot too. Those are some of the determining factors that a judge may be looking for. The appearance of cuts and or bruises. We will go into a little bit more detail on what that actually means. It's not always the case, but all these factors, these instances, the information that is being delivered to the judge, these are the factors that I'm going to actually use to determine the correct winner of that round. It is just putting to bed those misconceptions. Sometimes when you see statistics or fight metrics flashed up at the end of a round, that is not always the case. Judges do not have access to that information. They don't have access to what the total number of strikes landed. That's a graphic and that's an information thing that's separate from the actual fight. A judge is deriving their score and ascertaining their score from what they're actually watching live and real time at that moment, and is their determination and their assessment on the priority and where they see the impact and the immediate damage caused by the weight of those strikes. That is where all that emphasis is. Effective grappling, again, much like effective striking, it is always a quality over a quantity approach. If I am taking my opponent down from a standing position to a grounded position, if I close distance and body lock to you and I elevate you, I throw, shoulder throw, hip toss you, belly to back suplex, and I elevate you and I bring you down to that mat with significant impact, that is something that will factor and determine more in a judge's assessment than if we simply body locked and I tripped you to the mat and landed in a guard or half guard position. Again, it is always about the quality over the quantity approach. Bottom position fighters who are on their back with an active and threatening guard, it is entirely possible to win a round from your back. It is not always the person who's on top who is winning that round. If someone is on their back in a closed guard, if they're using an active and threatening guard from a submission point of view, that is something that a judge will always consider. If they can break the posture, use a closed guard to break a posture and pull their opponent in close and then start with striking as well, that is also a factor that can show that a fighter can effectively win a round from his back. When it comes to submission attempts, it's the same theme. It's the recurring theme of quality over quantity. If I have a deep submission, I apply a lot of pressure on a joint lock, or I'm in a strangle or a choke, rear naked choke, head and arm choke, triangle choke, whatever it may be. If that requires great effort to get out of and actually escape, I know that I'm tiring, weakening and affecting my opponent more significantly than positions that are merely thrown up from a closed guard position or a half guard position, and I can easily shrug them off. It's that recurring theme again, without fear of repetition. It's always the quality over the quantity approach. Sometimes who appears to be the busier fighter or the more active fighter, they may not necessarily always be winning that round. A lot of the time they are, and they could be. Their output is greater, their significance is greater, their damage and impactfulness, it's all greater. But sometimes the guy, particularly if we were looking at a counter striker, he may be moving lateral and backwards and not have not have as great an output as his adversary who's moving forward, but half of his shots are missing. The person who's counter striking and moving back, he's actually scoring in a more impactful and damaging way, even though they've thrown half the amount of strikes. They may have had 2 submission attempts, but they were far more significant than something their opponent had employed earlier in that round. Like I say, to reiterate, the most important point to get across is we are always looking to give credit to the more impactful and damaging strikes and or submissions and or throws. That is our job. It is a fight, and it's something that we have to consider. A good analogy that I've always employed is if we're playing a video game and you see a beat 'em up video game and there's two figures or 2 fighters, and you'll see 2 power bars and various moves are employed. Once a special move is employed and there's great impact and a hard strike and or something else has happened, you will see a greater chunk of that life on that power bar go down. That's exactly the same that happens in a fight. When we're subjecting fighters to detriment by striking and or grappling, the most significant, impactful and damaging output that we employ, that is where the weight and the difference should be attributed accordingly when it comes to scoring that round. If at the end of a round of fighting we think that was so close and we think that both fighters had the same output, they could have had a similar number of strikes, they both may have hurt each other, we couldn't actually pick, we couldn't actually pick a clear winner, and we think that it would be unfair to actually pick one fighter over another at that point, then we have secondary and tertiary criteria. And that's one of the more confusing things that happens in judging an MMA contest. There are actually only 3 things to consider as a judge in MMA, 3 factors, 3 points of criteria. The first, effective striking and grappling, we've just looked at. That will be enough. If I look into that in a competent and understood level, and I'm concentrating as a judge and I'm using my considered, educated and balanced approach to pick and define that winner based upon that criteria alone, in 99% of rounds, I can actually use that to help me. If and when I can't do that, if I think that the round of fighting was so close and it would be unfair just to fall on the side of A or fall on the side of B without a second's thought, that is when I have secondary and tertiary points 2 and 3 to consider. It is only if I cannot pick a discernible difference between number one, which is effective striking and or grappling, it is only then should I, as a judge, go on to consider the second point of criteria. And the second point of criteria is effective aggression. So point number two, effective aggression. What does that actually mean? And again, it's important to understand and reiterate, it is only when we cannot distinguish a discernible difference in effective striking and or grappling. It is only at those times when we consider that so close and so equal will we then go on to a secondary point to perhaps help us pick the rightful winner of a round. And that second point is effective aggression. Effective aggression, it kind of sounds what it actually means. Who do I ascertain as the person? Who do I decide is the person who's pushing forward, aggressively pushing forward in the fight, looking to potentially create a fight-ending scenario? Not just a person who's needlessly running forward, a counter-fighter. We've already looked what effective striking means. A counter-fighter can be moving effectively, evading shots, missing shots, and then coming back and scoring heavily with themselves. The effective aggressor in the fight will be moving forward, pushing the pace, closing that distance and bringing the fight continually to his opponent. If that is the case, and like we said, that we cannot pick a difference between effective striking and grappling, if we are sure in our minds that we can easily identify a more effective aggressor in that contest, who's moving forward, who's bringing the fight to them, who do we ascertain could be in a more likely scenario to potentially bring an end to that contest. That is a secondary point of criteria that we can consider to help us choose a winner of that round. So the third point of criteria would be the cage control. What that actually means is the person who's dictating the pace, place, and location of that fight. The third point of criteria, as we're discussing now as cage control, that is something that's only ever considered if we know that point one, effective striking and grappling, is equal. Then we can move down to point two, which is effective aggression. Again, in a super close round, if we cannot determine and pick a winner using those two criteria on their own, only then should we then move on to the second backup, or plan B, if you like, which is cage and ring control. I believe that cage and ring control is directly inherent of point two, which is effective aggression. If I'm bringing the fight to my opponent, then as I say, by definition, I am dictating the pace, the place, and the location of that fight. An important point to make here when it comes to judging criteria is the word defence and the use thereof. Many times I've heard judges post-fight in their post-fight meetings or deliberation give some credence and credit in their scores to fighters who are defending, and that is wrong. In mixed martial arts, the defence of a fighter is never considered. It is your job as a fighter to evade and miss submission attempts and strikes coming at you. I do not give any credit to the fighter for defending. I am always going to give the credit to the attacking fighter who is giving the fighter something to defend. Defense is its own reward. I'm supposed to escape submissions. I am not supposed to get hit. I have to evade those things. But like I said, the emphasis there is given to the fighter who is actually giving the fighter something to defend. We don't consider getting out. We don't consider escaping. It's an offensive, attacking-based sport. And by such, the criteria and the judgment is always given the credit to the fighter who is doing so. Again, just to reiterate, judges must recognise that rounds of fighting may particularly be different. They should be well versed and educated to understand the different ranges of fighting, whether it be striking, grappling, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, whatever it may be. We've already looked at what the criteria actually means in good close detail, and judges have to be able to recognise the difference between a close round and that one of a round when a gap naturally starts to open up. We've looked at the application of effective striking and grappling, And if fights are starting to get close in that department, then we know that a judge has a secondary criteria in order to fall on, and that would be effective aggression. But just to reiterate and put that point across again, a judge should only ever move to and consider effective aggression if he is absolutely sure in their mind that they cannot pick a discernible difference between striking and or grappling. If all else is equal, and we move to point number 2, aggression, and again, in the very, very, very rare circumstance that point number 2, effective aggression, was considered as equal again, then we could move to the third and final point of criteria, which we know is cage and ring control. That is something, again, that we should very rarely consider, because a well-versed and balanced and educated judge will have enough at their disposal between effective striking, grappling, and or aggression. Some interesting points to consider when it comes to a judge's notation and the judge's assertion of who are they deciding as winning a round. We've already looked in detail at what effective striking and grappling means, and then some of the factors that we will use to determine what effective striking actually means. And we've already mentioned the appearance of cuts and or bruises may well help a judge ascertain who was the more effective striker in that round. You know, a cut and a bruise is not going to appear by itself. It is a byproduct of being effectively struck and being impacted by your opponent. But it's not always the determining factor. Sometimes, you know, in many instances, at the end of a round, the fighter who may appear physically to look the worse has probably came the worse off and absorbed the more significant damage in that round. But it's not always the case. At the end of a round, I could bring somebody in just to show them what two fighters look like. One fighter may have suffered a fracture or a break to the nose, so the blood is appearing. He could have a cut above his eye and bruising to his face. Some fighters react differently. Their skin and their physiological makeup is different. They will mark up and bruise and cut easier than other fighters. And like I say, generally or sometimes at the end of a round, the fighter who physically looks in the worst condition may well have been the fighter who was adversely affected in the worst way. But it's not always the case. A considered, concise and educated judge will always be able to determine the effectiveness of each and every strike that was landed. A broken nose and the appearance of blood and or cuts and bruises may not necessarily, on paper and on face value as we look at it, that may not tell the whole story of that round. An example could be, a fighter could throw 3 shots. The first one that gets through is the one that broke the nose and caused the nose to bleed. The second one was an elbow that got through and caused a cut above the eye. Again, something surface and superficial, but the evidence was there. And of course, the credence and I will give significance and consideration to that. But what happened for the rest of that round? Was I convincingly outstruck? Was the opponent at a disadvantage in terms of the number of legal strikes landed and the damage that was caused by them? In essence, what I'm saying is that it's not always the surface and visual appearance of a fighter at the end of a fight or the end of a round that signifies who won. The judge is always going to be there. They're well versed and they're given the correct score attributed to who they thought suffered the most effective damage in that round. Another good point to consider as well for judging is everyone's a judge, right? Everybody at home is a judge. But we know that's not the case because number one is they do not understand the criteria like we do. And on first look or surface look, they're seeing the things that we already know are not actually necessarily placed in order of how we're prioritizing the winner of that round. And a good analogy for judges to have in their mind, or anybody else watching that fight, is the difference between an active and a passive role. A judge sat in that chair is the active person. Their concentration and their thought process and their eyes are engaged on that full 5-minute round for the entirety. whether it's 1, 2, 3, 5, however long that fight lasts, that judge is actively engaged with the criteria in the back of their mind, painting a picture and giving an accredited score for what they saw. Everybody else in that world, whether they like to realize it or not, they may well be watching that fight, but they are not watching, firstly, with the criteria fully at the forefront and in mind. And the second point to consider is they are in a passive role. That means at any point in a round, they could look to the left or look to the right, or they can talk to their friend or talk to their colleagues, wherever it may be. They're not in the same headspace and they're not in the same mind space. And that's not the same for every fight, because some fights are very apparent and it's clear, but it's something for people to consider and people to understand the difference between an active role and a passive role. And a great analogy that I like to use is this. Yourself and your friend go into a car and you are the driver and your friend is the passenger, and you will drive round the block for 5 minutes. Let's use the same round time of 5 minutes. And we go back into the house or a building and you and your friend split up. And then somebody comes and asks you to write down everything that you saw. So the driver writes down everything he saw and the passenger writes down everything they saw. Would you think in general that they would be the same? No, they wouldn't. Why? Because as the driver, I'm focused. I'm the one who's intent. I'm the one who's concentrating. And I'm in a deliberate mind and headspace. So everything that I see in concentrated fashion may not necessarily be the same as you, as the passenger who is in a passive role, the person who can afford to be distracted by what's going on to the left or what's going on to the right or what's going on behind them. It's a good analogy and it's a good thing to think about, the difference between the person who is in that active seat, the driver, i.e. and or the judge, or the person who is in the passive seat, the viewer, the watcher, the commentator, or whoever it may be. It's a very different headspace to be in. So we've looked at the criteria in quite good detail, and we have ascertained what the criteria actually means. What does it look like? What are the things we're supposed to be given the weight to? What are the things we're given the advantage to? What sort of things should we be considering? What shouldn't we be considering? So when a judge has actually sat in their chair and watched the round of fighting, at the end of that round, that is when the judge will make the notation of their score. As soon as the round timer is up, the judge will then give their score to the allotted round, and then that score will be taken away. The reason that score is taken away is actually multiple. Number one is obviously scorekeepers, timekeepers, sanctioning bodies, athletic commissions are actually keeping a live track of that score as that fight unfolds. The second point of the deliberate action of taking the round score away from a judge at the end of a round is to be able to mentally reset them. We know that we're effectively judging 3 separate fights or 5 separate fights, if it's 3 rounds or 5 rounds. What we can't afford for a judge to do is at the beginning of the very next round to have their mind already transfixed on what they've done the round before. Sometimes at local level, at regional level or amateur level, a judge will be placed with a scorecard for the entirety of the fight. And many times you will see that scorecard come back in, and I've saw scores that have been attributed to a round and then they've been crossed out and they've actually swapped the scores around. That's not indicating that foul play was necessarily in order. What it's indicating is that the judges are in 2 minds. They're deliberating between a previous score given when they should be solely and totally focused on the round in which they're attributing the score to now. So if we remove the score from the judge at the end of the round, it actually completely, in a psychological sense, resets them. They've watched the round of fighting, they have attributed their score, and it's removed from them. They are then free and set and ready. The The 1 minute rest period for the fighters is also a 1 minute psychological reset period for judges too. They've given their score, they've attributed their opinion, they've wrote that down, and that's been collected and sent to the scorekeeper or the athletic commission. The very second the next round starts, that's when their focus and mental capacity will reset and they will concentrate for that round of fighting alone. So it is the importance, it's the psychological reset of the score being taken away at the end of that round. I cannot emphasize that enough, how important that is and how good a practice that is as well, for the reason I've said about entire scorecards for fights coming back in when they're crossed out and changed. We don't want the judges to have that in their mind. At the end of the round, the judge has watched the round of fighting, they've processed the information, they've given their score to the winning fighter of that round, it's taken away from them. The scores are live collated by the athletic commission, regulatory body or scorekeeper, and the judges are then free in their mind to move on to the next round and give the next score accordingly. Another important point to note would be a good policy or a good protocol for a judge to employ, and that is the use of notes and a notebook. You know, when a judge turns up to an event to carry out his role, it is only correct and proper that they have a notebook and pen. And the reason would be multiple, but more so the importance is placed on this. A judge may well be sitting in that judge chair for 3, 4, 5 fights. Maybe at a regional level, they are judging all the fights that night. So it would be unfair and it's unrealistic at them at the end of the night to be able to mentally recap or recall what happened in the second round of the third fight or the fifth round of the championship fight when they've been sat in that chair for potentially 5 or 6 hours. That's why a good, educated and competent judge will have his notebook there. At the end of a fight, if the particular fight has gone to their judges' scorecards and they've rendered their decision, it's prudent and it's pertinent and it's good protocol for the judge just to take a few series of notes, just some bullet points, just some things that he can recall back on in a post-fight meeting to be able to give his opinion or her opinion on why they went a particular way. It's good policy and it's good protocol and it shows willing from that judge too. It's very hard. I've been there in many instances when a judge may be explaining a particular score and you can see themselves that mentally it's quite hard to recap and recall, and then they'll start getting fights mixed up and rounds mixed up, and then it's just not a good look. So as a good, competent judge, if you have a scorebook there, and like I said, this is a private and personal thing, it's just a few bullet points, it's things of significance that happened in a round that actually made you go to the way in which you went. It just gives a reasoned and backed up explanation into why you went the way you did. And it's a good mental recap and a good mental reminder for you should post-fight meetings or commission meetings happen. It just shows, you know, a very professional approach, and it also corroborates and backs up with the scores that you are giving. So now we look at the scores that are available to judges at the end of a given round of MMA competition. The first would be a 10-10. Now a 10-10 round in mixed martial arts is a score that would very, and I do mean very rarely, should be given. The instances in which I would personally employ a 10-10 round is perhaps in a technical decision, or we have an incomplete round where there's just not enough action for me as a competent and well-versed judge to be forced into picking a winner. It would only be fair and just that if a round didn't go the full allotted distance, giving a 10-10, anything other than a 10-10 would be unfair. So the 10-10 is there. It is written, it is in the criteria, and it is available. But in all other instances, I believe that mixed martial arts is, there's too many variants, there's too many variables. There's striking, punches, knees, kicks, elbows, there's grappling, there's throws, there's submission attempts, reversals, takedowns. And a lot of those things, They may not necessarily play out in a round of fighting, but the variables are there. We also have to consider the time allotted to a mixed martial arts contest. For professional MMA, it's a 5-minute round. 5 minutes is a long time when we are looking at applying the criteria in a strict and considered way. And we also understand that we now have secondary and perhaps very rarely tertiary criteria to be able to help us pick that winner. So we're looking at the effective striking and or grappling in that round, one of which may not have played out at all. But we're looking at the impact, the damage caused, and the quality over a quantity approach. If we think that that was very, very close and we couldn't pick that winner, then we know that we have a secondary backup that we can move on to in the eventuality that all things we considered were equal. And that would firstly be effective aggression. Who was the person who was edging forward and pushing forward, bringing the fight to their opponent, the person who looked like they wanted to close out that fight in any given fashion. Those are the points that when you look into and consider would make a 10-10 round in MMA a very rare occurrence. There are too many variables and too many steps involved with understanding the criteria that a well-versed, educated and balanced judge should be able to render a score in that round. The 10-9 round, by far and away, the most numerous and the most, the highest percentage of scores that you will ever give in your life as a judge. Most rounds in mixed martial arts competition, when they're well matched and they're competitive, will render a score of 10-9. Now, the understanding of a 10-9 round and the scoring thereof is, as I say, looking at that competitiveness. We've already looked at the criteria and what that actually means. And a 10-9 round could be a round of one strike difference. I've already said about my belief and the thought process for a 10-10 round in mixed martial arts. But when you have a considered, educated and competent and well-versed judge who is looking analytically and actually into that criteria, when they are looking at even an educated, discernible difference and giving an advantage to a fighter in that round, that is when they're going to attribute that 10-9 score. It may not always be that close because a gap of even significance can open up. You could have a fighter in a round who is actually significantly well ahead in terms of striking and or grappling. And we know that if they are well ahead in striking and or grappling, we don't even have to consider points 2. And if we don't consider point 2, then we'll never have to even think about point 3 in existence. So the score of 10-9 is a score as a judge that you will most often give. And as I say, just to reiterate, that could be a very finite and close round, but it could also open up into quite a discernible difference when the fight is objectively scored to somebody who's edged ahead and moved ahead, not in a significant way, but in a clear and concise manner to be able to attribute them a 10-9 score. So now we're going to look at what will constitute a 10-8 round in mixed martial arts. A 10-8 round in MMA is the discernible difference between that of a potentially close 9 round in a 10-9 or a gap that's actually opening up to a fairly significant lead in a 10-9. When that actually crosses over into 10-8 territory, and what are the things we're going to be looking for to help us ascertain and understand that difference? From a training perspective, there are three Ds, 3 words that I can look at. It's a more pragmatic way for me to determine as a judge that I should be absolutely rewarding the fighter with a 10-8 as opposed to a 10-9. Those 3 words are damage. We've looked at what damage is going to signify in terms of effectively landing concussively or bodily onto my opponent, the cause of cuts, the cause of bruising, submission attempts that cause opponents to tire and weaken, things that require great effort and resilience for the opponents to stay in that fight. So damage is the number one consideration. The second consideration would be domination. Domination could be positionally. If I take somebody down into a grounded position and I'm working around their body, passing from a closed guard to a side mount, getting a mount, taking their back, just positionally working around their body, keeping them down and dominating them in a positional sense. And the third factor, the third key word for me to help in 10-8 round deliberations is duration. And that duration may not be one single block. It could be the whole round, but it could also be significant portions of that round that could add up to more than 50%. So if I've got 30 seconds of the first minute, I could have 20 seconds of the second minute, I could have 40 seconds in the fourth minute, etc., etc. But the key here is for me as a judge, as a well-versed judge, to be able to reward the difference between 10-9 rounds and 10-8 rounds, and the differential in a 3-round fight of awarding that extra point is quite significant. But I need to be sure in my mind and have the common sense and pragmatic approach. Like I said, we have those 3 words that are there to help me. If, as a judge, I can tick the boxes of all 3, that I know I was damaged, I was dominated, and the duration of which occurred, it is without question a 10-8 round, and I should be giving that score accordingly. It is possible for 2 of the Ds to happen. I could have domination of my opponent positionally, and I could have that for the duration of a round. So domination and duration are there, but damage isn't there necessarily. I may not have had submission attempts. I may not have been striking concussively or bodily at my opponent, but I've got 2 of the things there present. That should at least give me deliberation or consideration as a judge to be thinking or leaning towards a 10-8 round. But a good thing to counter that is obviously based upon the word competitiveness. If my opponent is remaining competitive and fighting back and doing what they should in that round, it keeps that gap closer. So just to recap, if as a judge, I am absolutely sure in my mind that an opponent has damaged, had duration and domination, it is without question a 10-8 round. It will present and should write itself. If 2 of the key D words are present, which would be domination and duration, that may not necessarily lend itself to having a score of a 10-8. The overriding factor here, as we've already ascertained, is if we have all 3 present, it's clearly a 10-8, without question. If 2 of the 3 are present, one of those would generally be the damage factor to consider. It is entirely possible for me to have a dominant position on my opponent for a significant duration of that round, but may not necessarily lean itself towards a 10-8, and that is all based upon the competitive nature of the contest. If my opponent is doing enough and worrying enough to fight back, trying to get out of that position, as we say, we know we don't reward the defence, it's its own reward, but if that bout and that round is remaining competitive, it may be enough. And the key word we use there is fighters will earn their way back to a 9. If you are competitive by nature, you will earn your way back to a fairer score. If the gap is opening up by ascertation and deliberation of the 3 Ds, damage, domination, duration, that is the factors that we will use to consider a clear and concise 10-8 round in MMA. Now we look at the third and final score that is available to a judge, again without point deductions, in unified mixed martial arts, and that is that of a 10-7 round. A 10-7 round should be a very rare score that is given by a judge, mainly based upon, again, the competitive nature of a round. Sometimes that gap will open up so much that it will warrant a stoppage, or a stoppage may occur. But in some instances, a 10-7 round may present itself, and effectively what we're looking for there is a complete and total domination from a fighter over their opponent. We would know without consideration and without deliberation that damage, domination and duration would all be present. That would be without question, without consequence. There are some examples of 10-7 rounds out there to be able to go and have a look in Google within mixed martial arts, and you can see exactly the kind of things that we're talking about. But the 10-7 round in MMA is a very rare score, perhaps even more rare than a 10-10 for technical decisions. But that 10-7 round, it is there. It is a score that's present and usable for judges. But as I say, it's a rare occurrence, and it is total, whole and overwhelming damage, domination and duration that would be present to render that score of a 10-7 on a scorecard. Okay, so we've looked in great detail at scoring criteria. We've hopefully ironed out a few of the misconceptions in the use of and the application of the 10-point must system. The criteria, what does it mean? What are the points of criteria available to judges? How are the scores rendered? What are examples of scores, 10-9, 10-8, 10-7, etc.? We've looked at all those things. Now when it gets to the end of contests and we're looking at decisions, when decisions are rendered, what it actually means, a lot of it you would think is common sense, is self-explanatory, but that's the purpose of this course, to offer explanation and give definition to them. So what are the ways to win and what are the decision types? KO, knockout, should be fairly self-explanatory. If a fighter is incapacitated in a fight and they could be knocked out to the body too, the fight is obviously over at that point and it is ruled a KO by the referee. The referee is the person who ascertains and determines what the method of stoppage was. Second point to that is the TKO, the technical knockout. The main difference to offer there is what actually constitutes the KO, the difference a referee will use between the KO and the TKO. And the definition will be as follows. A KO is when a fighter cannot intelligently defend themselves, i.e. they're incapacitated, unconscious or temporarily separated from their senses. They don't know what's happening. They clearly cannot defend themselves. The fight is over. It's a KO. The TKO or technical knockout is when a fighter is not intelligently defending themselves within the realms and decision making of the referee. So if a fighter is hurt, it could be standing, they could be concussively dropped to the floor, they cover up and the referee wants to call a halt to that contest because they are not, in their eyes, intelligently defending themselves, and the referee steps in and avails the fighter. That would be ruled as the TKO. We've also already looked at some other instances of technical knockouts. If an injury caused by a legitimate technique, a dislocation, a break, wherever it may be, anything of that nature that causes a stop to the contest, that again would be ruled as a technical knockout. Submission by way of tap out, submitting, or verbal. We looked a little bit earlier and we explained a little bit earlier what a physical tap out looks like. It doesn't have to be a 2 or a 3 tap process. It's a single voluntary action that shows me, you as the fighter, want to call a halt to that contest. You don't have to tap 2 times or 3 times. If you signify in one general motion to tap your opponent's body or the mat in any way, shape or form, the fight is over. A verbal submission can be a stop. You know, I could be in a cross arm lock with one arm trapped and I'm not in a physical position to be able to use my free hand to tap. In some instances, you may see a fighter tap with their feet. That's happened to me in the past too. So a good positional and peripheral sense of the referee is paramount to be able to understand these things in a positional sense, depending on where the submission and what the submission is that's being applied. A fighter can yell out at any point to stop the contest. If they clearly yell stop, the fight is over. When it comes to a physical scream, and understanding the difference. If a fighter is trapped in a submission, there is a huge difference between a fighter showing restraint and grunting, almost as if they were in an uncomfortable position. That's something to allow. A fighter can work his way out there. There is a huge difference between that and something of a physical sudden scream, something that a referee would determine as inflicted pain on a fighter. If a fighter does that and they determine a scream or a cry out in pain, a referee would stop the fight and it would be classed as a verbal submission. So decisions via the scorecards, what are they and what do they mean? The first would be a unanimous decision, quite clear that all three judges would be in favour of the same winner. The second would be a majority decision. That would be that two judges are in favour of the same winner and the third judge would have a score draw. The next would be a split decision, which means two judges would have fighter A and the third judge would have fighter B. Then we would look at score draws. The first would be a unanimous draw. All three judges have a score draw. That could be via the result of a 10-8 round in a 3-round fight, or a point deducted that results in the score draw being present. The second would be a majority draw, which would mean two judges render a score draw and the third judge would have a winner. And the final would be a very rare split draw, and that would mean that all three judges have a differing score. Judge 1 has fighter A, Judge 2 has fighter B, and Judge 3 has a score draw. A technical draw or a technical decision. We've already looked in great detail in the foul segment of the referee's training, what actually constitutes a foul and my protocol and procedure for dealing with it. A technical draw or a technical decision, that insertion of the word technical will tell me that I have not gone the allotted distance for that fight and I've been forced into the scorecards in the third round of a 3-round contest or the fourth or fifth round of a 5-round contest. Next decision would be the no contest. We've already looked at how a no contest would occur in a fight. That would be when we are dealing with an accidental foul in the first 2 rounds of a 3-round contest or within the first 3 rounds of a 5-round contest. If it's called a termination of the bout at that point and it can't continue and the referee deemed the foul as accidental, it would result in a no contest. So I would like to announce that this is the end of the online content. I want to thank you for your time and I want to thank you for your patience in listening to the information that I had to give. I hope that you found it informative. I hope that you found it detailed and all the necessary information and questions that you may have had were answered. If you would like to know more or would like to contact me for further detail, please use the social media apps to contact me. Thank you very much.